Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So we'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Balkozar Adam, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist with decades of experience working with children, adolescents, and their families. Dr. Adam graduated from the Cairo Medical School in Egypt and completed her adult and child psychiatry training at the University of Missouri, Columbia. She's a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and a Distinguished Fellow of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. She is board certified in both psychiatry and child adolescent psychiatry, and we're honored to have her with us today. So, Dr. Adam, you have 15 minutes to present. I requested all our attendees, if you have any questions for Dr. Adam, you deposit them in the Zoom chat box. For our in-person attendees, if you could just write down your questions on these cards here, we'll address them inshallah in the discussion. And without any further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Adam to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm going to talk about caring for the Muslim youth during the pandemic. I have no conflict of interest. Today, my objective is to understand 3 areas that impacted Muslim youth as related to COVID-19 and identify 2 ways the practice of psychiatry by international medical graduates was impacted by COVID-19. So to get started, let us think about who has been at risk and how being Muslim affected that. What you will notice is that during the pandemic, it became apparent that minorities and non-white are at high risk for hospitalization and death. We see that more of our community members are either essential workers or live with essential workers. American Muslims make up a disproportionately large segment of the frontline workers, risking their health and that of their families. This study used the hazard ratio to check the impact of religious affiliation and COVID-19 related mortality. A hazard ratio is a measure of how often a particular event happened in one group compared to how often it happened in another group over time. The study found that compared with Christian, all religious groups had an elevated risk of death involving COVID-19. The largest age-adjusted hazard ratio were for Muslim and Jewish male. The research also noted that lockdown had been associated with reduced COVID-19 mortality in all religious groups. What does the literature say about Muslims? Overall, American Muslims were slightly more likely than the general public to face negative mental health impact since the start of the pandemic. They are more likely to feel nervous, anxious, on edge, down, depressed, and hopeless, feel angry more than half of the days, has some difficulty sleeping, and there is also increased conflict with household members. Restriction impacted social, cultural, and religious interaction and the practices that are of specific importance to members of the Muslim community. And anxiety was associated with the essential fear of contracting the virus, and sadness and low mood was associated with restriction. Muslim youth were not able to celebrate Ramadan or Eid with the community. They were not able to go to the mosque, Islamic center, or Islamic school. Kids stayed with their home. They were lonely. They could not see their peers or their extended family. Some practiced positive religious coping, like considering COVID as a test from God, accepting it, which had helped with decreased depression and anxiety. There is a report of possible positive impact of COVID because many families stayed home and parents worked from home and the kids were at home. The family prayed together, ate together, fasted together. The parents were able to better understand their children's emotions and needs. Some factors to consider. We know that mosques provide spiritual, social, emotional, and sometimes even financial support. Many times you see food at the mosque with the youth enjoy while talking to adults and their peers. However, not all Muslim youth go regularly to the mosque. So clinicians need to count religiosity factor and the importance of the Muslim community for this particular patients. Research from ISPU noted that age seemed to play a role in the impact of COVID-19 on mental health. Younger adults are more likely to have negative mental health impact compared to older adults. The disruption of routine, education, recreation, as well as concern for family income and health is leaving many young people feeling afraid, angry, and concerned for their future. So school closure and isolation lead to increased screen time, decreased physical activity, consumption of unhealthy food, and sleep disturbance. This leads to academic deterioration, depression, and anxiety, and increased risk for substance abuse. Studies from Japan and England reported increased suicidality with the lockdown. UNICEF reported that there may be 1.6 billion children who suffered some loss of education because of COVID-19. So while working with Muslim youth, understand how religiosity can be leaned on as a protective factor when appropriate. Work to help them develop coping skills while addressing living in uncertainty, and advocate to provide them with culturally informed care. Now, thinking about the psychiatrists treating these children, many of the Muslim psychiatrists are international medical graduates. However, now we are seeing more of the new generation psychiatrists to be American graduates. We are going to learn about the unique challenges faced by international medical graduates and how to support them. Who are the international medical graduates? They are about 1/4 of the US physicians. They come from over 150 countries. The heaviest concentration are in New Jersey, New York, Florida, Illinois, and Michigan. 30% of active physicians who are IMG are psychiatrists. IMG are more likely to be psychiatrists than anesthesiologists, dermatologists, or pediatricians. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on the overall well-being of everyone. It has been associated with worsening mental health and has placed IMGs at high risk of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicidal behavior. I don't need to tell you that COVID-19 changed everything. We are still dealing with the stress and loss of the pandemic, and that is experienced by everybody differently. Like many of you, I went from going into the office every day, seeing patients from 8 to 5, stopping by the grocery store on my way home. And on the weekend, I would see my friend, do some shopping, and be with my community. When we went on lockdown, I didn't leave my house for months. I felt isolated and lonely. I constantly worried about my health and my family's health. When some of my family members overseas got sick, I couldn't visit them. When they died, I couldn't attend their funeral. I cried for them thousands of miles away. IMG, who work in nephrology, reported how COVID worsened their physical and mental health. They worked close to sick patients for long hours. Even with their hard work, many times they weren't able to save them. This led to significant emotional trauma. IMG face other challenges that make them at higher risk for negative mental health outcome. Many started their job or training later than expected because of visa issue. Even if they have a secure job, it wasn't clear how long it would last. Like the rest of the healthcare worker, IMG switched to telehealth, but they were often not as tech savvy as others. Healthcare workers are putting their lives on the line and witnessing unspeakable trauma and death, but many do not have the mental health support they need. We are seeing the hint for this crisis. A survey in 2020 found that 18% of doctors have increased their use of medication, alcohol, or drugs because of the pandemic's effect on their job. 50% of doctors surveyed reported experiencing inappropriate anger, tearfulness, and anxiety. Yet, only 13% have sought medical attention for their mental health. More than half of the doctor reported feeling burned out compared to 40% of the doctor 2 years earlier. This statistic from 2021 are pretty startling. 8 out of 10 doctors were impacted by the pandemic. Nearly half saw their income go down. A third saw their staffing go down. Some were let go, others left because of burnout. Between 2020 and 2021, the percentage of doctors who felt inappropriate anger, tearfulness, or anxiety went up by 7%, but only 1% more sought medical attention for their mental health issues. The disruption in work-life balance was a huge stressor. People were no longer able to leave work at work, and they were doing this with kids on their lap and school in the room next to them. Some of the warning signs of burnout to watch out for are constant anxiety and sadness, difficulty concentrating, decline or disinterest in work, or loss of compassion towards others. The stress that the IMG faced before the pandemic didn't get better, it got worse. IMG got sick, their lack of support was even harder. Visa issue, which was tricky to start with, became even more impossible to navigate, and many of them couldn't visit sick family member abroad. We can get through this together. We can become reformed perfectionists. Not everything has to be perfect. That goes for our personal life as well. These struggles are real, and it is hard, but they don't define us. As Alina Eglowitz writes, adversity refines us. We can come out stronger and more resilient. In order to do that, we have to support each other. That begins by recognizing that IMGs are vulnerable group. Establish good communication channels with them. For the administrator in this group, keep IMG updated. They are worried about their job and their future. For the rest of us, check in on your friends. Like we said, many don't have family, but friends are a good substitute. Ask about their mental and physical health and talk to them about their families. Sometimes they might just want to share stories with you about them. Alina Eglowitz came up with 5 things we can do to combat burnout. Find a healthy relationship with anger. Don't bottle it up and wait for it to explode. Pick your battles. Not everything is worth fighting for. Be kind and compassionate to each other, to the families we treat, to strangers. Support each other and realize it's okay to live with contradictory truths. With this, thank you for listening, and I appreciate your questions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, and Jazakallah khair, Dr. Adam. So as an IMG myself, like, this topic is near and dear to my heart, and I appreciate your compassion and your concern for the community, and our prayers are with you. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our 2 guests in person. So we have with us today, I'll just share your screen. I'll share your slides on my screen. Dr. Adam, if you could exit your screen share, inshallah, I'll share my screen. Thank you. Hold on. Do I need access for this?
No, she just on it. Oh no.
Oops. Yeah, sorry about that.
No, no. Like, let's go.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about the delay, everyone. So we have with us today Dr. Is it Doctor?
No.
Okay, well, all right. All right, Miss MohammmadShareef holds a BA in psychology from the University of Wisconsin, as well as certificates in childhood and adolescent studies and cultures and community studies. She's also received formal training for Quranic exegesis skills in Al-Qasid Institute in Amman, Jordan. Alaa currently conducts research at the Family and Youth Institute on the history of Muslim mental health. In addition, we have with us Minha Ghani, a research assistant with the Family and Youth Institute. She graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a bachelor's in psychology. Minha is passionate about mentorship, youth development, and creating a stronger community. Minha is currently working on the FYI's I Belong project, aiming to create a sense of belonging for youth in American mosques. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, there you go.
Perfect. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I am so very happy to be with you guys, especially in person. My name is Alaa MohammadShareef, and this is Minha Ghani, and we're both from the Family and Youth Institute. Just a little bit about the Family and Youth Institute. We are a nonprofit organization that does research within the Muslim communities. We provide resources to educate and empower community for positive development and change. You can find us on social media, and please do like and follow. So I am, alhamdulillah, we're all here. Social isolation has impacted us for the past couple of years, but aren't we all excited to be emerging from this social isolation, right? The theme of this conference. Social isolation has actually been considered the second pandemic because of the impact that it has had on many. The ISPU has put out a study in 2020 regarding the impact it has had on young adults and the decrease of young adults in mosque attendance. And this has been impacted even further by COVID-19. The recommendations that have been put out in the report by the ISPU was that we focus on the belonging needs of young adults. The sense of belonging and human connection is a basic human need. It, as obviously known by many in research, and then it is very highly spoken about in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Human connection provides support, solidarity, and a buffer against trauma, especially in the marginalized communities. So the study from the ISPU talked about how the young Muslims, the young adults make up 29% of the Muslim adult population, but only 1/3 of the number of young adults are actually present in these mosques. So the question we want to answer is, where are all the young adults? Through our study, we posed the question of the belonging needs of both the adolescent stage and the young adult stage. And so this is a part of a larger study that we've been doing. So while everybody was in social isolation, we were crunching data for the I Belong project that Minha will talk about in detail.
So like Alaa mentioned, our specific presentation today is focusing on a specific component of the I Belong project. The I Belong project is a 3-year project with the Family and Youth Institute, where we're looking at exploring and increasing these feelings of sense of belonging that that adolescent Muslim Americans experience in masjids across the country. So the 3 phases of this project include a needs assessment, which our presentation today will include, as well as the second phase includes interventions, where we'll go into different communities and mosques around the country to really work on improving and increasing the sense of belonging that youth feel to the masjid. The third phase is where we'll take all of this research we've done for the past 3 years and put it together in digestible resources so that the general public can benefit from all of our research and really work on increasing the adolescent belonging in mosques across the country. So like I mentioned, today we're focusing on the needs assessment. It has 3 different components: the survey, which our presentation is on today, the data confirmation webinar, as well as the interviews. The interviews you'll hear more about from the presentation after us with Zara and Hanan. So with the survey, we used Qualtrics and we disseminated the survey via listservs, social media, student organizations, and word of mouth. We also analyzed the data both quantitatively and qualitatively. Qualitatively using a thematic analysis and quantitatively using correlation and regression.
So our study sample comprised of 328 young adults of the ages 18 to 29. Our mean age was 23.7, and we had about 61% were female. The majority were of middle class, and the student employment status was a mix of students and employees. We posed 2 questions, and we asked these on a Likert scale from strongly agree to disagree. We asked our participants whether they felt a sense of belonging during adolescence, and how strongly they agreed with that, and then also a sense of belonging that they felt or feel currently as young adults. As you can see, about or a little over 50% of our participants have shown that they do feel a sense of belonging in the Muslim or in the mosques.
So going off of those questions that we just looked at, with the young adult participants reflecting on their past belonging as adolescents and their present belonging as young adults, we actually saw through a correlation that those participants who reported a higher sense of belonging in adolescence were also more likely to report a higher sense of belonging as young adults. Going off of that data, we also did a multiple regression and looked at predictors and factors that impacted psychological distress, which was measured using BSI, the Brief Symptom Inventory. So we controlled for age, gender, SES, and religious identity centrality. It is to be noted that both SES and religious identity centrality did impact, were impactful predictors of psychological distress as well. But referring back to the about belonging, we had both, for those who reported increased sense of belonging in adolescence, they experienced decreased psychological distress as young adults, while young adult belonging did not affect psychological distress as young adults. So there really is an emphasis on this belonging to the masjid that you feel when you're an adolescent. Going into the qualitative data. So we asked our participants 4 questions. Again, we asked them to reflect back on their adolescence. What factors were causing them to belong to the masjid when they were adolescents? What factors were pushing them away? What factors were the barriers? And we asked them to reflect on their current situation as well. What is helping them? What is preventing them from belonging? So we're going to go ahead and overview the main themes that we discovered during those questions. And this was, again, an open-ended question. So we looked at their open-ended responses to find all of these different themes. Here you can see that the largest impactor for positive belonging was interpersonal connection. Those one-to-one connections people form with others at the mosque. Community connection, also this general sense of belonging to the congregations, general sense of belonging to others at the mosque, also with a large impactor. Other influences included programming, spirituality, and religious practice, shared identity, and routine. Just simply visiting the mosque every day after school or going every Jummah with your family. Moving into the negative themes, we see again, this more interpersonal factor also is negatively impacting people's belonging. So drama or judgment you face as a youth in the mosque, the people that say unnecessary comments to you or might be rude to you. We also see, similar to what ISP reported in the 2020 study, familiarity. Being new to the mosque really was also an aspect that made people feel they didn't belong, not knowing others there. We also see identity mismatch and discrimination, ideology mismatch, which focuses more on differences of religious beliefs as well as moral values that didn't line up with others at the mosque. We also see organizational issues had the least impact. This is This has to deal with masjid leadership and management, as well as programming in terms of quantity of programming, as well as relevancy. Going into what our participants related is currently affecting them as young adults, we see again, community connection and interpersonal connections are still large, still have a large impact. We do see, however, that as young adults, there is an increased emphasis on community connection as well than there was in their adolescence. Here we also see a larger increase in spirituality and religious practice having a larger impact, and programming is also programming shared identity, as well as some other mentions of inclusivity in their mosque were also positive impactors. Going into the negative influences, we see some changes here, especially with religious and spiritual being an increased category, as well as we had a lot of people who were uncertain as to why they didn't feel a sense of belonging. They weren't sure exactly what it was that made them feel unwelcome, but there was just something that made them feel like they didn't belong at the masjid, as well as people who weren't as active as they wish they were. With religious and spiritual, it's actually really interesting to note that we had many people report that their feelings of guilt and sins kept them away from the sense of belonging at the mosque. They felt as if their past was preventing them, or they'd be judged on their sins, as well as this almost imposter syndrome going on with being Muslim. Like, I'm not Muslim enough to belong to the mosque. I'm not a good enough Muslim. A lot of people reported this sense of insufficiency with how they were practicing. So Alaa is actually going to take a deeper dive into some of these things for us.
Awesome, thank you so much. So as you guys saw from the data, interpersonal connections were very important and significant for the sense of belonging. The way that we described interpersonal connections was any level of connection with another individual in their congregation. So not necessarily a deep, long conversation or a friendship, but any interpersonal connection with other individuals. So looking into the sub-themes, for example, in the adolescent participants, we see that friends is large on this pie chart. However, every other relationship mattered as well: peers, adults, and family. And then when we look into the young adult sub-themes, interpersonal connections, again, friends, peers, family, adults, and then another general category, which includes deeper, it includes relationships of any sort.
So going back into the negative belonging, interpersonal issues, these are kind of these negative interactions that people are experiencing at the mosque, whether it be one-on-one or the community in general has a lot of drama or exclusion going on. These are these negative experiences that they face. So with adolescents, we see all these different sub-themes here that are represented, such as bullying, gossiping, etc. But the main thing to note here is many of the adolescents actually, while they did mention what was happening, they had a greater emphasis on who was enacting these behaviors upon them, who was gossiping about them, whether it was adults, peers, the general community. So this is something we noticed with the adolescent responses and not the young adult responses. So the participants, when they reflected on their young adult experiences, they no longer were pointing out, my friend was bullying me, the other students were bullying me. They focused more on just the actions themselves, and there's less of an emphasis on the individual level. Going into identity differences and discrimination. So we as humans are very, very complex. We have a lot of different social identities that we identify with. And this category really encompasses people who reported not feeling that they could find other people who match their ethnicity or their age or their gender in the mosque, as well as people who are discriminated upon for these social identities. So like I mentioned, includes age, gender, ethnicity, people who are converts. And the main important thing to notice between the adolescent sub-themes for identity differences and for young adults is here you can see that gender does impact. Gender is that bigger orange one right there. You can see it's a pretty large factor of not belonging, like some sort of discrimination around gender. But what you see here is gender no longer matters for the young adult not belonging, the young adults not belonging at the masjid. So these are the same participants who reflected on their youth as well as their current belonging. And it's really interesting how not a single one of our respondents mentioned that they didn't belong anymore because of their gender. So what is it that's changing between adolescence and young adulthood that makes gender no longer keep us from the masjid? I mean, it's great that's happening, but we'd love to dive into it and really figure out, like, what is it that's the differences between gender and these two groups?
Awesome, thank you so much. And in terms of what we have been noticing our mosques are doing, the concentration increasing events or different programs. It's a very important factor. However, what our data is showing is that interpersonal connections is a far more, in fact, it is the #1 factor that impacts a sense of belonging for adolescents. So it is more than just the friends. It is all of the different relationships and how we can consider the positive ways of, I guess, continuing to keep sense of belonging through these peer relationships, adult relationships, and the family role as well. So when we talk about the developmental stage of both the adolescents and the young adults, the needs shift greatly. When we look at the adolescent stage, interpersonal connection matters in terms of friends and what they think about them and appraise of adults. However, shifting into young adulthood, the sense of community connection has a greater impact. Again, interpersonal interactions had a large negative impact on the sense of belonging. What we uncovered in our research is the various forms that this comes in through drama, judgment, familiarity, discrimination, and then the ideology mismatch. Again, being Muslim is not enough in terms of a sense of belonging to the mosque. Mosques have to be intentional to create inclusive spaces and learn how to navigate these diversities. Some of the limitations we would consider is that we were less likely to reach individuals who are not connected to the Muslim community. And those are individuals who we do want to obviously consider for have a sense of belonging in these mosques. For a positive youth developmental approach, what we really want to do is dive into the nuances of these positive interactions. So what about the friendships? What about the relationships with the adults and the peers, the imam, makes this or creates a sense of belonging? And again, we want to compare experiences based on the different subgroups, the gender, race, ethnicity differences, and the convert and revert status within the communities. Just another reminder, this was a portion of the larger I Belong project, and what we explored here was the results from our qualitative surveys, and the next presentation from Zara and Hanan will talk about the results from the interviews.
Thank you all for your time.
So yeah, this is like a really smooth transition. We have 2 more members from the same institute who are going to kind of carry this forward. So I'd like to welcome them to the stage. Yeah, so we have with us today, I'm not muted, right? Yeah, I'm good. Okay, yeah, we have with us today Hanan, Hashem, yeah, who is a PhD candidate, and Zara Khan, who is at the University of Texas at Austin. You guys have the floor.
All right, assalamu alaikum, everybody. All right, so thankfully, a lot of this has already set up the context of the study, so we can kind of skip over that a little bit. But as you can tell, there's a lot of like really complex and rich data that was already shared. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go kind of a little bit deeper. Well, we're going to really focus on adolescents. So this whole weekend, we've talked so much about the negative impacts of COVID, and so we can talk about it again, right? Social isolation, suicide, domestic violence, all of these different factors that impact Muslims. And of course, we have these adolescents who not only are going through these struggles, but are also dealing with being an adolescent. I don't know if y'all remember, but being an adolescent was not a very fun time for many of us. And so imagine going through that and then also going through you know, that social isolation that can really impact their support and belonging. And we know from the research that a sense of belonging is a really strong protective factor against a lot of negative experiences that young people face. So this project is really taking a positive youth development approach, which basically is telling us that instead of focusing on like reducing risk factors, how do we make things work better? And so that's what this project is really focusing. How do we create enabling environments for young people to really thrive in their communities? So again, this project really is focusing on American Muslim adolescents. We have these different phases, and hopefully with all of the information that we've been able to gather from the needs assessment, our goal is to take all of this information, create interventions within communities, design, implement, and evaluate those interventions, and then create very, inshallah, helpful resources for the community, for communities across the country. So the survey, it is, if any of y'all, I'm sure y'all are familiar, it's much easier to collect nationwide data from young adults. And of course, we needed a place to start, right? We just asking like, what is your belonging experience to adolescents can be a little bit difficult. Giving them a little bit more concrete questions can be more helpful. So that was really the purpose of the survey. We're part of the purpose of the survey is to understand like, what is this, where can we go to understand what's happening? But of course, we weren't talking to adolescents and we want to know the adolescent experience. So for the I Belong project, we're actually partnered with 5 different communities across the country. And so we took the information that was presented earlier and we actually presented them to those 5 different communities through webinars. And they were interactive webinars and we basically asked teens, adults, parents, mentors, is this what's happening in your community? Is this what's actually going on? Confirming that data. And then we took all of that information. We took the literature from previous data and just previous information that we have and created interview questions. So these were the themes that came up from the adolescent belonging. And we mapped them onto the 8 main features of positive youth development that are suggested by the National Council of Medicine. And what we found is that the first 4 here are really the ones that stood out. And so what we did is we created interview questions based off of those themes. And we didn't create these interview questions by ourselves. We were really, really intentional about incorporating the community in all of the decisions that we were making. So making sure to ask the communities, what do you think about these questions? What do you think about the wordings? Are the adolescents in your community going to understand? Like how can we make this really as comprehensive as we can? Okay, so in terms of procedures, the individuals that we interviewed were all from the communities that we are partnered with. We had a screening survey, and then so that we can get a diverse sample as possible. And then we had our interviews, we did the analysis, and of course, everybody was compensated for their time. So today we're going to look at the data from 6 participants, and I just want to say that we do plan on interviewing more people, but you will see that there's a lot of there really is a lot of rich data, and we are not going to be able to go through all of them, so we kind of picked and choose the different ones. But as you can see, pretty diverse sample of participants from different parts of the country, different identities, ages, and of course, we want to ask adults and we want to ask teens because we want everybody's opinion, we want the community's opinion. Okay, so these are our general categories of questions that we asked. So think about those interviews. And so we found that, so basically we can think about it as like 4 larger categories. And then within these categories, there are different like smaller categories. There's absolutely no time for us to go through each one of these. And you'll see like how much like complexity and richness there is to this data. So instead, what we're going to do today is we're just going to focus on the first one from each of this list. So spiritual connection, youth leadership, adults, and race and ethnicity.
So within the Majid category, we focused on spiritual connection as one of the themes, and we have 4 various factors that we found that influence adolescent belonging, such as, so the first factor that we looked at is worship, and basically, participants stated that doing activities such as reading the Quran every day together at the masjid or praying together really increased their spirituality. So next, spirituality as a priority. Participants reported that the spiritual aspect at the masjid was being pushed more so to the side and wasn't being given as much importance, which was impacting their belonging. And that feeds actually into incorporating spirituality. And what we found is that participants reported that efforts to incorporate spirituality really increased their spirituality and impacted that adolescent belonging. For example, some participants said, cleanliness being part of their iman, staying 5 minutes after salah, things like that. So the last factor that we found was aesthetics. And for example, one participant discussed how decorating the masjid for certain events, such as the birthday of the prophet or commemorating a funeral, really impacts that, aesthetic, which impacts the belonging. Okay, so within programming, the next theme that we've focused on is youth leadership, and we have 3 factors within that also. So the first factor we have is decision making. And so basically participants interestingly enough, some participants kind of reported that they did feel appreciated when they were given the space to voice, certain opinions. And we also found that based on what other participants said, that the opinion of what youth voices were saying wouldn't necessarily affect the final decisions. So looking at collaboration with adults, we also found here that some participants said that, it would make more sense for decisions to remain in the hands of the adults, but, other participants maybe stated that there was a bit of a disconnect that made it difficult to collaborate with adults. And lastly, youth representation. So participants did report that youth representation on the Masjid board or the leadership is quite essential and would impact that adolescent belonging.
Yeah. Okay, so the role of adults in the masjid really cannot be overstated. And I also want to say that the role of adults includes all adults, and that's everybody here as well, whether you're a parent, a mentor, a leadership, or just like someone who goes to the masjid. So all of those relationships really came out. Today we're just going to talk about the first three. So for the sake of time, I can't show quotes for all of them. I don't want to overload you, but if anyone's interested, we have it all, so we can definitely share that data. But we're just going to go really over the themes. So in terms of leadership, there were 5 themes that came out. The first one is access to leadership interactions with the young people. So some teams were like, I don't even know like who is on the leadership, and that actually really makes a difference. I wish they would just come to our events. I wish they would just like say hi to me so that we can like have a discussion. Also relatability. So this is interesting. So the leadership, the person who was in leadership that we interviewed is actually their masjid board is actually made up of young people in their 30s, and they talked about how being younger on leadership made them more relatable to the young people and really they had a stronger connection and impacted belonging. Whereas other, people were like, there's just like a generation gap. Like we don't even know how to talk to them. And so that can really be a barrier. Then there was advocating and prioritizing. So people talked about how when leadership were advocating and prioritizing youth needs, that really increased belonging. And then decision making. So in regards to, are the youth consulted when they're going to hire a youth director? Are the youth consulted when they're going to create, make changes in the masjid? And then rigidity. So quite a few people talked about how there's a lot of strictness, a lot of like adults have the final say. One person talked about how like the adults seem to be very self-centered in terms of like their understanding of what youth need. And so like when they were trying to like hold a youth event, it was really for the adults, but they like called it like a youth event. Parents really came up, right? Teenagers are very much reliant on their family. In terms of the themes that came up, there was parent-teen sync. So people talked about when parents kind of understood the struggles of the teenagers, they like kind of brought them to the masjid. They spoke about the leadership. They spoke to the leadership about the different needs that young people had, and that really had an impact. Trust, whether the parents trusted the masjid. So trust and mistrust really came up. So really thinking about like, how do we build trust with the parents so that young people can really benefit from the masjid? Encouraging attendance came up. So are the parents bringing their kids to the masjid, or are the parents just like, hey, come, oh, you don't want to come with me, that's fine, right? And so thinking about like, what is the parents' understanding of the role of the masjid in their life? Extension of the home. So whether the parents themselves felt like they belonged to the masjid and felt like, this is something, we just go to the masjid all the time, right? And so thinking about like the masjid as part of the home. And then lastly, involvement in activities. So going even further, how are the parents involved in the activity? So people talked about like maybe getting parents, maybe having a rotation of parents as chaperones, maybe like, parents just kind of giving ideas, like making decisions with the young people. And then there were mentors. So mentors are really, I think, really just incredibly important as cultural bridgers. And that's what came up in the interviews. The mentors are really the ones that can kind of communicate the needs to the needs of the young people to the leadership, but also kind of communicate what is going on with leadership and how to understand adults to the teenagers. And so they really kind of bridge that gap for a lot of young people. They were there for advice and conversations. They've experienced a lot of the things that the teenagers experienced just recently, so they were more able to kind kind of speak to those experiences. They were advocates for the teens. So one of the mentor talked about how the parents would come to him and be like, hey, what is this event about? Like, what do you think? Like, should I take my teen to it? And then also it's really important to note that quite a few people talked about how they're really needed, but also very limited. So thinking again about the young adult belongingness to the masjid, what are we doing to bring young adults to the masjid? And again, you can see, right, like we need to really be thinking about everybody in order to create like a really healthy system.
Okay, so within intergroup relationships, we also focused on race and ethnicity, and we found, based off of the interviews, 5 factors that I will go into. And the first factor was racism. So participants reported, again, kind of differing ideas. So like some people kind of just said, you know, everybody's equal, whereas other people said that there is racism that might exist within their community. So it really just varied based on the interviews. And then the next factor that we kind of looked at was shared identity. So participants reported that when you see a familiar face, someone who looks like you feel more comfortable, and that impacts their belonging, versus if you don't see someone, you don't see anyone who looks like you, and that also impacts their belonging in another sense. So the next factor that we looked at was language. Participants also reported that there was sort of occasionally a language barrier. So it was either, people maybe not speaking the same language as you, but then if there were other people in your community who spoke the same language as you, that was more of like a strength. Okay, and then the next factor, youth versus adult. So this was really interesting, and within the scope of specifically like racial and different ethnic groups. But basically what participants were reporting was youth attitudes versus adult attitudes. And we found that, based on what they were saying, youth attitudes are really influenced by adult attitudes. And then, even a participant saying how youth are more open or more receiving to different types of groups, other types of people who might not look like you. And then the last factor was humor. So participants also kind of reported that there could be humor utilized in different ways, right? So some participants might have said like, they just make, just like friendly jokes, versus some people saying that they were made fun of.
Okay, so clearly a lot is going on, and there's a lot of richness. So just as a recap, these are the different, like some of the categories that we talked about. These are some of the themes that really came up, but there's so much more. There's really so much more that's impacting young people's belonging, and it's really important for us to be thinking about really taking like a multifaceted approach when it comes to young people's belonging. I think a lot of the times we have anecdotal data, right? We can all sit here and share stories about what your experiences were like, but I think it's really important to include diversity and experiences and identities. So one of the things to note, as diverse as our sample was, it's still important to think about, like the teens, for example, that we interviewed, they were more likely to say that they were like more likely to attend the masjid, right? So how would this information change if we interviewed people who weren't really coming in? In terms of order of categories, that's something to also think about, right? Some people said racism was a big deal. Some people said racism was not a big deal. So thinking about future research, like what would it be like if we created kind of like an assessment with all of these categories, and then people were able to kind of categorize the biggest barriers or strengths within their own masjid? Okay, so the next steps in regards to the I Belong project is the Black participants, this is important to note, the Black participants that we interviewed were actually African immigrants. And so it's important to note that there's a difference between the African-American experience, and we're actually working right now to recruit an African-American masjid on the West Coast to really get that West Coast experience as well. We want to, of course, include more participants, and then, of course, engage in conversation. So really, again, that back and forth, engaging with community organizers, thought leaders, and community partners about, okay, now we have this. What do you think? Is there anything else that we're missing? Further identify structural barriers, and in order to further identify structural barriers and brainstorm also effective dissemination strategies. And then taking all of this information that we found, bringing it to the communities and facilitating dialogue with young people, teaching them skills on how to advocate for themselves, teaching adult skills on how to listen and how to actively listen to young people, and then facilitating conversations between the teens and the teens and the adults on how do we increase belonging in your masjid, given the issues that are going on in your community. Of course, design, implement, and evaluate those interventions, and then really working on dissemination. So again, this is just one project that we're working on at the FYI. There's a whole lot of different ones. You maybe have already heard some of them. There are different talks today. Feel free to visit our website, follow us on Instagram to really kind of be up to date with all of this information that we have, inshallah. And that's it.
Thank you. And once again, I just want to reiterate, I'd encourage all of you to look into these organizations. We saw Access, we saw the Stanford Muslim Mental Health. We saw tons of great work coming out of the Family and Youth Institute, and these are all epicenters of great work and great wisdom, and they're much needed in the community. So, we humbly request all our attendees online to just follow them on social media, follow the great work they're doing, encourage them in any way possible. We truly need what they're doing for the community. So our next speaker needs no introduction, but for those of you who live under a rock, Rania Awaad is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where she is the director of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, associate chief of the Division of Public Mental Health and Population Sciences, and co-chief of the Diversity and Cultural Mental Health section. She's also the executive director of Modestan, a holistic mental health nonprofit serving Muslim communities. She's currently faculty at Cambridge Muslim College in Islamic psychology, a senior fellow at Yaqeen Institute and ISPU. In addition, she serves as the director of the Rahma Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating Muslim women and girls. Prior to studying medicine, she pursued classical Islamic studies in Damascus, Syria, and holds Ijaza in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of the Islamic sciences. We welcome Rania Awaad to the stage.
I should just get up so you stop talking. Mashallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Hey, able to hear me, inshallah? Voice coming through? All right, mashallah. Thank you so much to all the previous presentations. Thank you to FY and the amazing work you guys are always doing, mashallah. So excited to add a little extra piece, inshallah, to the conversation today. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mohammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Today, inshallah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a very large study that we partnered with the Yaqeen Institute. And I should first say there's no disclosures. And this lab, my lab is actually partnered with Yaqeen. Now, Yaqeen, many of you guys know, is an institute in Islamic research. They have several lines in kind of type of research that they conduct, one of which is on psycho-spiritual care. And so in that line of research, actually very, very soon, as soon as really COVID started, they kind of got on the ball and really started asking questions and sending out surveys related to COVID experiences and Muslims. Because of that, interestingly enough, now that we're 2 years from that point, we found actually that even when you compare with other researchers who were doing COVID-related research on other communities, our study actually ends up being one of the first and one of the largest on Muslim populations, which is pretty unique and kind of interesting. We didn't expect that kind of going in. The numbers, they're still collecting data because it's sort of ongoing in the longitudinal, but they are now at something like over 9,000 Muslims are in this study. So the N is huge, right? Inshallah. So we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot, quite a bit. Let me take you back to 2020 when all of this was first kind of coming onto the scene. Of course, these are early numbers. The numbers are much bigger, as you know, in terms of loss of life from COVID, and also the rate of disproportional effect in minority communities is very kind of marked as well. The economic burden, and particularly those who are already on the margins, experienced more difficulty with mental health in COVID than any other groups. Now, for us, what we were really interested in seeing is what were the perceptions and attitudes of Muslims specifically? Like, we understood this was, it's a pandemic. There's so many people that are affected in so many different ways. How are Muslim communities doing? One of the most interesting things is in March of 2020, right at the very beginning, when the lockdown at least happened for most people, there was a Google said that the searches, there were more searches on prayer than there were ever in any other time of the year, including anything related to Christmas or Easter or any other religious holidays, you know, Ramadan, etc. And the Pew Research Center put out a very interesting study on understanding how Americans, kind of broadly defined, all Americans, were doing in terms of what were they coping, how were they doing? And they found religiosity actually was on the increase. So it was nearly double what it was at 24%, but that's still double what it was before. So there was something about kind of making sure that when you feel kind of this uncertainty of what's happening, you don't know what's happening, you kind of reach out for something bigger than yourself, right? Faith, spirituality, the divine, however it's defined for different people. There was also a study on Orthodox Jewish community pretty early as well, smaller than our sample, but it also kind of hinted at that there was something about holding on to spirituality and a relationship with God that helped. So our research team was really interested and thought, okay, well, what are Muslims up to? What are we doing? How's it going in our community? Because certainly it's been tough in all communities. So as you know, there is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he actually foretells about the plagues. And the plagues in terms of epidemics, right? And now we're kind of dealing on a pandemic stage. A lot of people would quote this hadith when COVID first started and would talk about this concept of if you're in a location in which there is the plague, as the Prophet ﷺ says, don't leave that location, as in to say to stem the spread of any contagious effect of the illness, and do not let anyone in either so that it's more controlled. And a lot of our religious leaders kind of use this hadith to sort of say, look, this is why we need to isolate. This is why you need to make sure you don't spread the illness anywhere else. And then there were, of course, all the various fatwa that came out in terms of what happens with our prayers. How do we not go to the masjid? Distancing yourself in prayer. And then there were also other things that happened in terms of Hajj and Umrah. Like when we look at Mecca, and that is a place of the safe haven for Muslims, and it's shut down, right? The doors are closed for the first time in, not the first time in history, but one of the very few times, I mean to say, in history. It was very disconcerting for so many people. The sense of safety felt like it was gone. And of course, as you know, Hajj went from 2.5 million people, right before COVID, to 1,000 people in 2020 and 2021. And then, or I should say 60,000 in 2021, still very, very small numbers. All of this kind of plays a psychological role for the Muslims, right? A sense of like, what does all this mean? And so there are a lot of questions that started. We heard I don't know, all the different WhatsApp threads that many of you and your families might be on. You just heard all kinds of interesting theories and ideas, a lot of blame, a ton of xenophobia, particularly to people of Asian descent, a lot of blaming, right, that was happening. And then there was definitely the religious kind of undertone of the conversation. Like, is this a test? Is this a punishment? Is this Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trying to remind us of his grandeur and greatness, and and how we're really in need of him, and so on and so forth. So that kind of informed our questions. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, essentially right in that March, April of 2020, we launched the first set of questions and asked very specific questions like, what do Muslims believe and feel about the social isolation that's happening? And what are they understanding or kind of conceptualizing COVID to be? And the study took on folks that were 18 and above. So today I'm isolating our transitional aged youth between 18 and 24, and then past 24, kind of our adult population. Also, I'm specifically talking about the Muslim diaspora here. So out of all that global sample, we've taken about half of that sample is in the US, in Europe, Australia, right? Kind of like your Western countries in which Muslims are minorities is what we're kind of talking about today. As you remember, in 2020, we hit the first Ramadan in COVID, and it was right before Ramadan, and there was all this angst about how is Ramadan going to go? What's going to happen to Tarawih, Iftar, how are we going to check on family and be with family? The masajid will be closed and all the rest of it. So our second set of data was really specifically about what are the fears about Ramadan. And as researchers, we had our hypotheses. We thought already it's a difficult time. We know and Ramadan is so communal, and you rely on so many different friends and family and breaking fast with different people. We thought for sure things were going to get much worse for folks in Ramadan. That was our theory going in. And the third stage of our collection was actually right after Ramadan to see, well, how did it go, essentially. So here's a little bit about our sample. There's always more women in the sample. There's always more women in everything. Anyhow, the education levels were fairly equal, equal between the two groups. And starting from wave 2 onwards, we started to add specific mental health questions as well. Depression skills and anxiety skills in order to really understand how the mental health was happening. This is essentially when our team kind of popped up into the scene and said, hello, we need to ask mental health questions. Inshallah, it's really important to really capture what was happening right then and there. In terms of the measures that we used, many of them were actually previously validated skills in which we took into our study, and there were some that we needed to actually adapt as well to fit the Muslim community. So here are some of the findings, kind of really understanding in terms of perceptions. You can see here on the table that's there, everything from punishment to China, to sign of the end of times, test from Allah, wake-up call from Allah, punishment from Allah. I'm sure these themes are ones you probably have all heard in your various communities. Interestingly enough, the most common one that came up for folks is actually that this was actually a more of a wake-up call. More of kind of an understanding that this is something we're being tested, and it's a tribulation that we're all going through. And people that had more of that idea that this is a test or tribulation actually fared better in their mental health versus those who thought that this was a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The more that they thought it was a punishment, the more we saw negative coping mechanisms, which I'll talk about in just a moment what those were, kind of emerge, right? So there was definitely a correlation with how they understood or perceived Allah and their connection with God that helped to kind of mediated the conversation here. Now, there's a lot of numbers here. Don't worry too much about all these different numbers. What I will say is that what we found a very clear kind of connection is that those that had more difficulties with their mental health, right, were more likely to really kind of engage in these negative coping mechanisms. And those who had fared better are actually those who did a lot more of what we call the spiritual or religious coping mechanisms overall. General perceptions, I think I mentioned this already, but it's just interesting to note here, like in terms of when we say, what are these coping mechanisms people were using? We ask things like praying 5 times a day, reading the Quran, shukr or gratitude, kind of having a sense of gratitude that you practice daily. And it's interesting to see that, for most people, their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually got much better in COVID. There was only about a 1% that actually reported the opposite of that, which actually followed the national trends that we were seeing anyway. But in the Muslim community, it was so much more pronounced than in other communities. And I'll talk about that in just a second here. In terms of mental health, once we were doing the pre-Ramadan scales, we actually asked our PHQ-9, which is depression scale, and our G8A7, which is our anxiety scale. And it's interesting to see how people were doing. Right before Ramadan, about 12% of the sample would have met clinical levels of MDD or major depressive disorder. And 9% of the sample would have met the same for anxiety. Now, add to this, so that's kind of the baseline, but now add to it the levels of uncertainty that was coming with the pandemic. So one of the functions of anxiety is what we call uncertainty intolerance, being unable to tolerate uncertainty, like you don't know what's coming. And so because of that, we actually found that that's the biggest kind of issue that was happening for most people. Where they were getting stuck with COVID, essentially their well-being, was that uncertainty. Like, what are we going to do with it? So people that had a better chance and did better actually were the ones who kind of let go of a lot of that uncertainty and essentially did the term that we call tawakkul, right? Kind of relying on God, relying on something bigger than yourself. In terms of other forms of coping, there were also general coping mechanisms people did that we didn't classify as kind of neutral. We didn't say it was religious or negative. Things like, taking a walk, right? Kind of conversing with friends, cleaning your room as long as it wasn't obsessive. Lots of obsessive cleaning happened in lockdown. And then negative coping mechanisms were things like drugs, alcohol, watching illicit material, and other forms of kind of just generally negative coping. And what we found, as I mentioned, is that the rate of Muslims, their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and getting better, actually not just increased, but when you look at the national average of that 24% I mentioned, the Muslims were at nearly triple that rate. right? Nearly triple that rate. So there's something that's very marked. In fact, I'll just quickly just take a tangent just quickly here. There was just recently an interview where she finally published her piece, but she interviewed me right around this time that we were putting out all this data, and had this conversation with her, and she was going to look at all different faith groups. So she actually took about a year, interestingly enough, took her about a year to interview 30 different people from different faith traditions and different backgrounds. And what she eventually came to as the conclusion, she kind of circled back to us, the Muslim study. And she said, out of all the different faith groups and people that I've worked or kind of interviewed, the data that came out of the Muslim community was the most significant of all the different groups. It was the most marked, like it was very robust. And she said, it really, she's you know, she's like, I'm an atheist. That's what she said. And she's like, but this really made me think, what do I not have in my life that's missing, that's causing me to spiral down in terms of my own mental health? Really interesting, right? MashaAllah. It is amazing, subhanAllah. And she wrote, I'll give you guys the link afterwards. She wrote a long kind of essentially essay on the topic. And she talks about the consistency of things like prayer and prayer times, the consistency of needing to reach out to others and charitable acts, you know, various things that are built into our religious tradition that if we fall back on them, they actually help, right? Now, this was also interesting too, post-Ramadan. What we totally didn't expect is that the majority of our sample, 73%, actually said they had a better Ramadan than the previous year. And when you think about it, subhanAllah, like it's really interesting. Something about letting go of all the, what I call the clutter of Ramadan, right? All of the extra, you know, all the iftars, all the big gatherings and all the needing to host all these people and feeling obligated to host people, as opposed to letting all of that go and really doing the other part of Ramadan that we don't think about, its original form, which is introspection, right? Turning inward, and you're already isolated. So you might as well go your prayer rug and continue, you know, doing that kind of spiritual work. So interestingly enough, a lot of people actually had a better Ramadan, and that was totally unexpected by us as the team of researchers. And that carried on, by the way, into the second year. When we looked at 2021, we found the same, it was still an up, you know, kind of an up round from, you know, the Ramadan previously as well, subhanAllah. I have to say just really quickly, also a bit of a tangent, but because of the work we do with the women, you know, I have an organization called the Rahma Foundation with Muslim women and educating and training and also and teaching, I mean, and also qiyams. We have these like virtual qiyams that we built in Ramadan. They used to be in person, but then in COVID, we went virtual. We had to upgrade our Zoom account 5 times because on certain nights of especially the odd nights of the qiyams, I was like, where are all these people coming from? 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 women, mashallah, are in a single Zoom room doing a you know, by distance qiyam. And all of them, which qiyam is the kind of overnight prayer, right? The, you know, at least extended into the night, that you do the extra prayers that you might do in Ramadan. And for so many of those women, they would say, we never had this opportunity. We couldn't quite, because of different stages of our life. Either there's little people to take care of, or there's older people to take care of, or there's something to take care of. It's really hard to get to the masjid, or their masjid doesn't have the space for them, right? Or whatever it may be. But this gave them an outlet that was so powerful, subhanAllah, right? So when you do research, people kind of put all Muslims into one category. We're very specific about the woman's experience might be very different than the men's experience, right? SubhanAllah. We definitely found that here as well. A couple really quick things as well. Philanthropy, interestingly enough, we found that it was kind of like people donated less or the same or more, just about in the same amount of rates, but they were still as charitable. Interestingly enough, the Muslim community, there's another paper that came published just on philanthropy, and they found that the Muslim community in COVID was still very charitable, subhanAllah. So even the economic kind of downturn and kind of worries about that, they were able to still transcend that and donate quite a bit. So a couple of things in terms of our discussion here. We've known from before that the data in the literature before had showed that masjid attendance really does help mental health. That's what had been shown before. But now we were in this very new setting of a virtual setting. What does it mean to be in a virtual masjid or virtual community, right? What does it mean in terms of being able to, you know, how's your mental health affected when you're completely isolated? Because for sure, all the data is also showing the more isolation, the worse your mental health. But it's interesting. This kind of COVID-19 experience, particularly the Ramadan we had in this kind of more virtual setting, was very unique. It wasn't the first in history. And if you're interested, we actually do have a paper, both one in Yaqeen and one in Academic Press, that actually talks about the Muslim historical experience with epidemics and plagues in the past. And actually, it is amazing. We kind of all the gems that we took out of that, how Muslims in the plagues of the past really came together and did a lot of the same practices we saw people doing here. So there's something from the faith itself that really helps, even in these very difficult situations. So despite the challenges and despite the mosque closures, mashallah, people felt that they had had a better Ramadan. And here's that number I was telling you about, that's nearly triple, where that general American rate of increased religiosity and connection to God or to the divine was 24%. In the Muslim sample, it was about 70%, right? So definitely something much stronger. And that's what caused the journalists to come back to us and say, there's something very unique happening with the Muslims, right? SubhanAllah. All right, so in conclusion, inshallah, a couple of things. People ask, why is this? Why do we think that there's such a big difference or triple the rate kind of the general population? What's happening? There are some things about Islamic theological beliefs in terms of coping, when you think about a holistic belief system, in terms of really relying on God, right? Kind of letting go, letting God, that kind of concept, right? Tawakkul. That really becomes really important. Also, the theological beliefs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control. So in terms of uncertainty, when you tie your camel, as the hadith talks about, right? And you do your part and you let the rest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is something in that letting go that decreases a lot of that anxiety and uncertainty that happens as well. And this, by the way, was exactly the same for our transitional aged youth as our adults. In fact, for our youth, the one thing that was slightly different with them than the adult population is for them, there was only one thing that reduced anxiety in our sample, and that was husn al-dhan, having a good opinion of God, believing that God looks down on you favorably, and as much as whatever you're able to do is good enough, and Allah loves you for it. And so if you had that good opinion of God, your anxiety plummeted, subhanAllah. So that's really interesting kind of finding with the young people as well. Also, the core theological beliefs, the numerous hadith and Quranic ayat that talk about how this life is meant to be a test. It's interesting, this is shared with many of the monotheistic religions, but actually it's not shared with many other of faith religions. It's important to know that. For many people, they actually don't believe that life is a test. If you say that as like, oh, this is the Muslim belief, they'll say, no, that's not how it's meant to be. If you think of like the Buddhist tradition, for example, they have a completely different conceptualization of this. So when Muslims believe that life is a test, and then a pandemic hits and they go, okay, that's part of the test, right? It all kind of fits together. And there isn't this complete kind of tearing apart and falling apart because of it. And that's, I think, an important finding here as well. And lastly, as I mentioned, the uncertainty tolerance, that is the more that that Islam encourages kind of depending on Allah, and the more that a person kind of takes that up, the more likely they're actually to do better. And here is kind of the most salient of all of our findings, which is that the higher a person has, and this, by the way, doesn't have to do with the religiosity, which I thought was important too, and I'll come back to, but the higher your uncertainty level was, the more likely you were to develop MDD, or major depressive disorder, by 60%. When we took this data to kind of like our non-Muslim colleagues and clinicians and academicians and kind of shared this, I mean, all of it was kind of like, okay, that's nice. Okay, Muslims are doing better, nice, fine. Now this is where they all pause, because now there's a clinical correlate. When you go to the clinicians or academicians and say MDD or major depressive disorder, that constellation of symptoms that we use, the PHQ-9, which is the most validated scale for depression, and you look at it in comparison to this function of uncertainty and tolerance that comes from tawakkul or faith on God, from God. And now you can see a direct clinical correlation of a decrease or protection against a major mental health condition, MDD. Now everyone just stops and goes, so now I'm just kidding. Basically, it really gives them pause. It really does, right? Kind of like, whoa, you're onto something, right? And it's like, we're not onto something. This is part of the deen. This is part of the actual faith system. But it's really marked and really pronounced. And 60% is major. Even the most, even people that have had a really hard time talking about anything Islam related, cultural, mental health related, diversity related, these numbers give them pause, right? And I think that's really powerful and needs to continue to work, inshallah. We need to do more work on this in our research going forward. I always like to end with a couple of resources, inshallah, for you all to follow along. The chapter, there's already a publication. I think the link for it came earlier in the slides for the paper that we already published on this data. And then there's a book here called Islam, Muslims, and COVID-19 that Dr. Austin Padella and Dr. Amina McLeod are working on. It's in kind of press at the moment, but our entire chapter on the topic will actually be published in that book. So that's up and coming. And then some of the other books here that you're able to touch base with and get some good resources for, inshallah ta'ala. And with that, I'll close and thank you all very much, inshallah.
So one of the things I love most about my teacher, Dr. Awaad, is her humility, which is why I tease her about her achievements, of which there are many. And, you know, we have all this stuff up here. We recommend that you look into like all the organizations that Dr. Awaad is a part of. So Maristan, of course, like the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab, all these places are doing incredible work. And I think it would behoove all of you to look them up on social media to see what's going on up there. So at this stage in the panel, we usually like invite a discussant up to kind of summarize the key points. We like to have someone who is an expert in the field, someone articulate and well-versed and just who knows what they're talking about. And this time we couldn't find anyone, so they asked me to do it instead. But on a serious note, I found that, you know, two themes emerged in this panel and just throughout the conference at large. And the first theme was just this need to like maintain the integrity of the community. And we saw this yesterday with Dr. Mohsen. We saw this today as well with this like sense of belonging in the masjids and this need to like feel a part of something. And two of our speakers alluded to like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And somewhere up there, higher up on that hierarchy is like the need to feel like a community, a sense of belonging, that you're part of something that's bigger than yourself, right? And for the Muslims, that's the masjid. And a phenomenon that we see today is this disintegration that Dr. Mohsen alluded to yesterday, this disintegration where you have like, I won't say multiple identities because that's a loaded phrase, but it's like, there's like this disintegration between one's like identity, you know, with their college friends, with their high school friends, with their non-Muslim friends, and then like their identity at home with like their, you know, more religious parents and their more religious family and friends. And it's like, we need to like ground ourselves, right? We need to ground ourselves in this like integrous sense of identity. And that leads me to like the second theme that I saw emerge today, which was the need to kind of like hold on fast to that, like to that North Star, right? And I love the North Star analogy. It's like you have this like North Star out there, the sense of meaning in your life. You know, this is why I love Viktor Frankl. You know, you kind of find the sense of meaning in your life and you're like stumbling and bumbling towards that North Star. And like what our Deen teaches us is that like, you know, through our awkward stumbling and bumbling towards that North Star, like we can only hope and pray that God thinks that our stumbling and bumbling is, you know, worthwhile enough to forgive us for our shortcomings. And that's, you know, my prayer for myself and my prayer for all of us. I don't have much more to say. I'm open to sort of questions. So I'm going to see if you have any questions from our online panelists before I move on to questions from the live audience. Okay, so we have someone who's really eager to do work in the Muslim Mental Health Lab. Let's see. So there's a question here. Do the adolescent and young adults who already have gone away from the mosques, what are the ideas to bring them back with clear idea that we learned more about the need to change the culture? So I think this question is to our friends from the FYI Institute. Would one of you like to answer this question? And in the meantime, if anyone has questions for any of our panelists, would you like to write them down?
Okay, I have to admit I'm having a hard time understanding this question. So for adolescents who already have gone from the masjid, how do we bring them back? Yeah, so changing culture is hard, but we know that it's possible. And I think that data can be a really, really important tool for us to understand what are the areas of change that needs to happen. And so again, I'm going to lean back on the positive youth development framework, which really is focusing on like, how do we make things better so that people come in? And so we think about the inclusive spaces, we think about the relationships that people have, and really understanding that our Deen really asks us to be there for one another in different ways. And so I really just am going to encourage everybody to take accountability for like young people's involvement in our Deen and in our communities. And so I'm going to lean also on that like interpersonal piece, right? We have so much to learn, subhanAllah, from the Prophet ﷺ and how we like deal with one another and how we talk to one another and how we are with one another. And so I think in terms of like bringing people back to the masjid, I see that as like 2 steps after this project, but it's also like something that's really important. But just thinking about like people who you don't know, how are you interacting with them? Thinking about young people, even, you know, interestingly, young people were so, they really talked about how exciting it was for them when people who they didn't even know wanted to talk to them, and people who they didn't even like have conversations with were eager to just be like, oh, hey, I've seen you before. What's your name? And so I think that's something that we can always do within our communities. Yeah. So I know.
So if I could add to that.
Sure.
What you were talking about the mentors, right? Like
Yeah.
the mentors being the bridge between the youth and leadership.
Yeah.
So my idea would just be to like sending mentors like out into the community, or, you know, holding workshops, or,
Yeah.
you know, inviting youth into the space, because since they're the bridge, they're connecting those two.
Yeah.
They would be the best ones to kind of send out to gather the troops.
Yeah, I think mentors have a very distinct and significant role, but I also want to say that we all have a role, even if you're not within mentor age. If you're a leadership, general adults, we didn't even talk about that group, but just people who are just in the masjid play also a really big role. And I think mentors are definitely like, it's all important, right? But yes, I think mentors is definitely an area that we need to really be focusing on as well. But really, we all need to take accountability for like the role of young people in the masjid, inshallah. I hope I was able to answer your question, Muneza.
So we do have another session at 5:15. So that's the closing remarks of Dr. Farah Abbasi, and I would strongly encourage everyone to attend that at Harkness. That's in 7 minutes. If we can, we'll try and get to some of these questions in the chat. Otherwise, perhaps the panelists could put their emails out there for the attendees to email them directly if they're okay with that. In the meantime, let's see what we have here. So question for Dr. Awaad. She briefly mentioned the psychosocial skills used were adapted from Muslims. Interested to know what these adaptations entailed. Dr. Awaad, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. In terms of what was adapted, it was really whenever there was a question that needed to be focused more on Islamic beliefs. So if you're asking a question we didn't adapt anything from the PHQ-9 or GD7, we kept those exactly as is. But whenever there's questions that had to do with, you know, kind of something more theological that we were asking, like the idea of the tests or the tribulations, right? Those kind of things would be a similar question in the literature, but we would kind of Islamify it for lack of a better word for it. In terms of if you're looking for other skills, I don't know if the question was asking if there's other skills that are kind of psychometric skills that are specifically custom tailored to Muslims. We have, and we've actually used that in an upcoming study that I didn't present today, but it's an upcoming study on converts and that we're doing with the Yaqeen Institute as well, that we took my MPAM scale, which is the Muslims Perceptions and Attitudes to Mental Health scale, which was developed in the lab and validated. And it's actually published in the Journal of Muslim Mental Health. So it's actually free and available online. You can just go to that article, and in the index section, the entire 18-item scale. It used to be 40 items, and then when we validated it became 18 items. But whenever you want to look at perceptions and attitudes in Muslim communities, it's a robustly validated scale that's tailored to the Muslim community. Inshallah, there'll be more like that out there, but we need more skills that are specifically custom tailored to the Muslims, and that's one, inshallah, you can use.
So there's a question for Dr. Awaad. Do you mind sharing the article from the journalist, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, how can I get
Perfect. Yeah, if you can put on mobile, that'd be great. So there seem to be some more questions in the chat. I humbly request that the online attendees kind of write their questions again so that it comes to the bottom, because I don't want to miss anything that may have been lost up here somewhere. Okay, so there's a question. Is there any data for adolescent and young adults who are from LGBT or trans groups in Muslim communities? Is that one of the factors at all or not coming up in the study because it was not looked at and that group sometimes feels written off, and how do you approach it? So based on the timestamp, I think this is for, yeah.
I can talk a little bit about. Should I come up there?
Yeah, why don't you come up? Yeah, thank you.
So this isn't necessarily something we saw the adolescents mentioning much, but in the young adult experiences, we did notice that a couple people mentioned kind of in that the identity differences and discrimination category. Some people mentioned that their masjid was queerphobic, transphobic, homophobic, and this also made them feel like they didn't belong, whether or not they identified with that identity, just like this general environment made them feel like they didn't belong. And we also had other people mention that they didn't see other people who are LGBT at the mosque, which again, seeing people who are like you, like that is very important in your belonging at the mosque, these representative spaces. So we did have a couple people report on that just in their young adult experiences. However, these people did not reflect as much in their adolescent experiences. Yeah. Cool.
There's another question actually for, I think this is for you, the second one. Can you just read this out?
That one?
The second one. Yeah.
Oh. What steps need to be taken to address the impact of race on belonging?
I believe so. Yeah.
I skipped a quote.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're,
Oh, on census. Thank you.
Yeah, because you mentioned race was a big issue, and you talked about that.
Yes.
But what steps are you
Yeah.
thinking that need to be taken in the mosque to
Yeah.
improve that sense of belonging?
Yeah. So my co-presenter Alaa kind of mentioned that being Muslim isn't enough, right? Just going to the mosque and the fact that you're a Muslim and there's other Muslims here isn't enough to make you feel like this is your space. This is for you. It should be, but it isn't, because your other identities aren't being represented. There might not, like, specific people did mention that, especially Black persons did mention, like, I'm not Arab, I'm not Desi. Everyone's speaking Arabic here. I don't know. Everyone's speaking Urdu here. I don't relate to these people. There's no one who looks like me here. All of those 320 participants, those were all quotes. Everyone typed out their experiences for us. Some of them were paragraphs. So we read through everyone's experiences anecdotally. And you see a lot of this in terms of addressing it. Do you want to add on?
Yeah, I just want to say, so I think what's a really important part of this is that really leaning on the community and seeing what their needs are. And so, like, as we do the interventions, for example, one question that we really want to ask everybody is, like, what would be helpful for you and what's important for you? We can talk about, like, the different suggestions and things about, like, intergroup contact, education, and things like that. We can definitely talk about that. But I think in regards to this project, we really want to lean on the wisdom from the communities themselves and what they know works and what we know, like, actually facilitates, like, disconnection and ostracization. So I feel like that's a little bit of a general answer, but I think it's also because we're not there yet in terms of figuring out the solutions. That really is our next step. But I appreciate that you're really thinking, like, okay, now what?
So I think, like, all of it's just to, like, help create this inclusive community, these inclusive communities that we really want. And
ISPU has a lot of resources in terms of, like, how to create those inclusive spaces, which we'll be leaning on, inshallah.
And then, can I add on to that?
Sure, yes.
So, my dissertation on intersectionality and belongingness and suicidality. And so that is the question that I'm asking. And it really is, for me, it really comes down to understanding the isms, not necessarily the social categories. So is it race or is it racism? And that is what is shaping the lived experience of those individuals. And it's not just the racism, it's the intersectional oppression of the xenophobia and the Islamophobia and the sexism. So to comprehensively look at it and understand belongingness, you really have to look at it from this intersectional perspective.
Yeah.
I just had a question. Did any of the respondents mention, like, having had a previously, like, bad experience with, like, say, another parent at the masjid, like, you're not dressed appropriately for the masjid?
1,000%. Yeah, that really came up a lot. I think, I think for some of them, we were trying to figure out. So if you recall, in Minha's presentation, that really came up with adolescents more so.
So, like I mentioned, when we were talking about the negative interpersonal interactions that the adolescents faced, some of that judgment came from judgment in how they're dressed or how they're wearing their hijab, or what they're doing at the masjid, like, oh, like the uncles are yelling at us for, like, playing in the masjid. Just all these sort of, like, they had a lot of different groups of people commenting on what they were doing.
Yeah, I remember one interview, actually, I asked the young person, like, do you want to interact more with other parents? And he's like, not really. Yeah. He was like, the way that they are now, I don't really want to. And so that definitely came up. It's not just, like, the parents. But then we had another team that said, my friend's dad is really important for us. He like gives us, like, you know, he makes sure to like take us to different places. He's like really involved. And so they did come up, other people's parents did come up. And so put them in the parent category, in the general adult category. It's I think, again, that sense of like responsibility comes from everybody.
Even in the survey responses, you also see that people did mention that there were positive experiences with adults as well. Like people mentioned, all of my dad's friends say salam to me when I'm at the masjid. They might not be their friends' dads or their friends, but even like people that their parents knew, just saying salam to them, that made them feel like, okay, someone here knows me. Like I'm not just another person at the mosque. I'm someone that someone knows. Even if it's on that very basic interpersonal connection level, just name the name, you know, just someone you can say salam to.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
Can I just ask one question of Dr. Awaad? You know, during COVID, we saw all the anti-Black racism, Black Lives Matter protests going. Did you address any of that in the study? Yes, I didn't hear anything about racial racism.
In the study, no, absolutely. In fact, thank you, Lisa. And we had a team actually, part of the clean data set that we kind of worked on, because right after, so that was kind of like collected data in March, and then April, May, and then June, as you know, was really like for Floyd, and all was happening. And so we actually, our fourth wave of data collected all of that information. And yes, there were definitely market differences, definitely across the races. And then we actually took data and extrapolated from a different data set on specifically also on belonging, also on discrimination, mosque attendance. We actually have a paper in press at the moment. And then Elisa, I don't know if Elisa, you want to talk just a minute about your presentation from earlier today that addresses that.
So we looked at how different races help the racial identity.
Sorry, could you use your voice?
We looked at how racial identity impacted and how their knowledge about Black history or how much United States was helping in terms of our measure was racism impacted that.
It's coming out, Joelle.
It's coming out. Okay. I'm looking forward to it.
Very quick comment, because I know we're short on time. It's both to the FYA and the Stanford Muslim Mental Health. I'm a Turkish Muslim American immigrant, and I think, I may be wrong, but I think compared to the other Muslim American populations, we are a relatively newer immigrant community in the US. We don't have many second and fourth generations, right? Like I am a first generation immigrant and I'm one of the older ones who came to the US. And I've noticed a great lack in literature, even when talking about Muslim communities. So I'm wondering if whatever research you're doing, you don't have a lot of mosques or masjids, but we have a lot of community centers to kind of see if you may want to also include Turkish Muslim Americans, because we are very seldom included in research studies, but I do know that not necessarily for other topics, but with youth, it's really, really important because they're kind of struggling with what maybe the other Muslims have struggled years before, but it's very new to them.
I'd be happy to know that we have a strong Turkish community in our lab.
That makes me very happy.
We have a strong Turkish, I would even say Ottoman presence upstairs. Once the Turks come in, you know, it's just
I know we're crazy. I can say that, it's my culture.
But I hear you. I hear you very clearly. And honestly, we hear the same actually from our Indonesian Malaysian community, the same from our Bosnian community. Basically,
American.
Right, there are so many communities that are very much marginalized. We're in the Muslim.
Yeah.
Regional diversity too, Southwest, just New York and Arizona.
Guys, so I just like to humbly request all of you to kind of go down to, I think it's the Harkness main auditorium where we're having our closing remarks by Dr. Farah Abbasi. One last time, I'd like to thank you all for coming here, taking out the time. I deeply appreciated all of the panelists who spoke. Thank you so much for offering your insights. Yeah. Dr. Adam, Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for everything. We appreciate your kindness and taking out the time. Would you like to? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Balkozar. So good to
How are
see you.
I
We missed
love
you.
what you said.
Wallahi, we miss you. Next time, inshallah.
Next year, inshallah.
Inshallah, inshallah. Allah barik fik. Thank you. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Like, I have to get shiny. I have to be.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm ending the. Thank you.